Getting your first EMTB can feel like a pretty daunting task. The technology is relatively new and seems to be changing exponentially fast these days. It should come as no surprise then that we get a ton of questions regarding EMTBs that come through our customer portal all the time. And that's why in this video, we're gonna cover a few of the most prominent ones. But rather than just standing around answering all those questions, I thought we'd make it a little bit more interesting and answer all your questions about EMTBs while we take a little trail ride on my personal EMTB, the N8XE.
And because I can't let Wendy have all the fun, I've decided to join her aboard my Polygon Colossus TLE. And that's actually a great segue to our first question. What are the different types of EMTBs? There are two main categories of EMTBs. You have your full power bikes and your lightweight or SL bikes. Full power bikes, as the name would imply, have larger motors, or at least more powerful motors, and larger batteries. So you're talking things like full power bikes. A big number that you're gonna look for is torque. Full power bikes usually have around 80 or more Newton meters of torque, and SL or lightweight bikes are usually between around 40 and 60 Newton meters of torque. Another big difference is in battery size. Full power bikes have bigger batteries, usually 500 to 800 watt hours, whereas lightweight bikes have smaller batteries, usually around 250 to 400 watt hours. Obviously, it should go without saying that there are going to be some pros and cons to both of these. As far as the full power bikes go, the pros are going to be increased range as well as increased torque or increased power, helping you get up steep climbs or accelerate more quickly. But the con, and this can be a big one for some people, is weight. So for example, Wendy's Colossus T8XE weighs a good 10 or 15 pounds more than my Colossus TLE, which is a SL or lightweight bike. Inversely, the pros of these SL bikes, like the TLE I'm riding, is that they are lighter. They also handle a lot more like a, traditional analog trail bike, in the way that they, jump in the air, go around corners. But there are some cons. Biggest cons there for me and for most people, I think, is the battery range. You're not going to be able to go on as long of rides. But another con is the reduced power when you're winching your way up steep climbs. It's also worth noting that in those two categories of full power and lightweight, you can get yourself basically every other discipline of mountain biking. So you can get yourself a full power enduro bike, full power trail bike, really even a full power cross country bike, and likewise with SL. You can get an SL enduro bike, an SL trail bike, and SL cross country bike. Wendy is on what you would consider a full power enduro rig, and I'm on an SL trail bike.
Thanks for that, Josh. But I think we might be getting a little ahead of ourselves. Now let's circle back and talk a little bit more about what an EMTB is and how it works. Most EMTBs don't have a throttle like you see the high school kids ripping around with. And that's actually a really good thing because most mountain bike trails don't allow throttles if they do allow pedal assist e-bikes. EMTBs come spec'd with one of two different motors. So there's the hub drive, which is actually in the wheel, and there's a mid-drive motor, which is in the middle of the bike, in the frame. Now, mid-drive is definitely preferable for EMTBs because it has a more natural ride feel, but it's also better weight distribution, as you might assume. It's the weight's carried in the frame rather than the wheel. Another cool feature about EMTBs is they typically have different modes. For example, my EMTB, the N8XE, has a eco mode, which is your most chill. You're not getting a ton of assist from that motor. That's a good one if it's a cold day like today and I want a little extra burn. It has a trail mode, which is what I find myself in most of the time, especially on climbs, or a boost mode. In the boost mode, you feel like you're on a little dirt bike ripping. Again, those modes are different and have different names sometimes, but they're always spec'd on an EMTB. So that brings us to our next question, which is how much power do I actually need? And the big word that you want to look for here is torque. Now, most bikes break down between like an 80 plus Newton meters of torque or 40 to 60 range Newton meters of torque. The lower power bikes, 40 to 60 Newton meters, are still going to get you up the climbs, but you might find a few more limitations, especially on steep climbs. And If you're riding with a group, all on high power e-bikes, you might find an issue there. Keep it up.
Hey, hey.
See ya.
Hey. Another question we get asked all the time is how far you can ride an e-bike, or in other words, what is its battery range? And that's a complicated one to answer because it really does depend on a lot of different things. Things like the rider's body weight, the terrain you're riding, of course, what power mode you're in, right? How much force you're putting through the pedals, all of that is going to dictate what your range looks like. But I can give you some general ideas. I actually did a range test on this very bike just a little bit ago, and I was able to ride 15 miles or around 2,000 vertical feet on its 450 watt-hour battery. Wendy did a range test on the Colossus NAE a couple years ago. That has a 630 watt-hour battery, so about 200 more watt-hours, and she was able to ride over 30 miles and still had juice left over in the battery, which is super impressive. Now, while we're talking about range, it's worth noting that a lot of EMTBs, the manufacturer of the motor will also sell what they call a range extender. And that's basically just an external battery that you can fit in your bottle cage or has its own place where it can mount to the frame and basically does what the name would imply. It extends your battery range. So the TLE, which has a Bosch motor and battery, does come with a 250 watt-hour range extender included with the bike. That would usually cost you $600, so it's really cool that Polygon includes that. But that's a way that you can get increased range out of an SL bike like this.
So how much can you expect to spend on a trail-ready quality EMTB? Well, as you might imagine, it's definitely going to be more expensive than your analog counterpart, acoustic, whatever you want to call it, non-motorized bike. And that's mainly because of the motor and the battery cost, alongside some other specs. But I'd say ballpark range is 3 to 10 grand. Now, we at BikesOnline have some of the most competitive pricing when it comes to EMTBs. And if you're really looking to just get the most affordable option that's still going to be trail ready and great quality, you might want to check out the T6E. The T6E comes spec'd with 85 Newton meters of torque. That's some good full power action for you. And 504 watt-hour battery. Phew! It also has Shimano drivetrain, brakes, and SR Suntour suspension.
Speaking of the components found on that T6E, that brings us to our next frequently asked question, which is, what should I look for when buying an EMTB? Obviously, we already talked about all the motor and battery and torque and all that sort of stuff, but you still have all the other components that any old mountain bike has. For starters, because EMTBs are heavier and oftentimes you're riding them faster, it's not a bad idea to prioritize stiffness and durability and strength over weight savings, especially when it comes to things like tires and wheels. You know, using a stronger tire casing or a burlier wheel on an EMTB than you would for a comparable analog bike is not a bad idea. Speaking of speed, another place where you might consider, upgrading a little bit is with your brakes. So, getting bigger rotors or going with, like, say, a metallic pad over a resin pad on an EMTB isn't a bad idea, just to help slow this big heavy bike back down again. The third and final place where I'd maybe recommend, looking for something a little bit different than you typically would on just an analog bike is your chainring and your cassette. We've already talked about torque. E-bikes are putting a lot of extra torque on those components, which can make them wear down and potentially break more quickly than they would on an analog bike. So getting a steel chainring or a steel cassette, even though they're heavier, they're gonna last a lot longer with the added stress that an e-bike puts on them. So unless you're wanting to have to change those things out quite often, then yeah, not a bad idea to just run steel instead of aluminum. But just about everywhere else, honestly, it's the same stuff. So if you see someone trying to sell you a e-bike specific saddle or e-bike specific grips, it's probably just a marketing gimmick. You don't need to pay extra for that. Just run the stuff that you like on your analog bike, maybe bump things up, make it a little burlier here and there, but otherwise, it's the same thing.
So, how do EMTBs actually compare with, a regular bike, a non-motorized bike? And there's a lot of answers to that question. I'd say namely, the first thing that comes to my mind is weight difference. An EMTB, just solely for the reason that it has a battery and a motor, is gonna be heavier, just hands down. But when you think about climbing, as I'm doing right now, ripping up this little hill, I can get so much further, so much faster. And I mean, if you've never been on the EMTB and did a climb, you're missing out. It's hard to go back to an analog bike once you rip up a little hill like that, or a really big hill. I think when it comes to descending on an e-mountain bike, that's when personal preference really comes in. I know a lot of people that prefer descending on an EMTB because it's heavier, you stay grounded, rooted, and even if you're hitting a jump or a feature, maybe you don't have enough speed, you just give a few pedals in trail mode or boost mode, and you get that speed easier. I'm still one of those freaks that prefers to jump my bike analog, non-motorized, though I have a really fun time on the EMTB too. And I think that just comes to personal preference. When I wrap up the package deal of getting to get more miles, especially as a busy parent, then I think the EMTB takes the cake for me there. One of my personal favorite questions was, can you ride an EMTB in the rain? No, you will not get electrocuted. Let's just make that clear right off the bat. You can ride your bike in the rain. Unless, of course, you're me, who's used to riding dusty Central Oregon trails and can't ride an EMTB or a regular bike in the rain. Oh, shoot. Well, thank you for joining us today in this video. But it's that time where you better get your bike, whether it's an EMTB, analog, or whatever type of bike you're riding, get out on the trails and get ripping. Yeah!